A most original and creative talent in our business. Would you welcome Mr. Orson Welles?
Ladies and gentlemen, Orson Welles again, come to call for another visit.
Good evening. This is Orson Welles.
All right. Well, hello again. It's great to have you folks back. We have another Orson Welles for us, but this is, of course, another one of those Orson Welles-less Orson Welles episodes. So we have a guest that's presenting again, and we'll get into that and some of the ground covered. I'll flip it over to Vincent to tell us who we have that's covering for Orson and get his insights, and we'll go around the table. So go ahead, Vincent.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Buck mentioned, Orson Welles is gone. I couldn't get a clear indication of exactly what he was doing, but I think this is a continuation of him having new projects in the pipeline. He's not 100% sure exactly what he's doing. The only thing that's for sure is he will be making the film that becomes The Lady from Shanghai with William Castle, another film director and producer at his side. But the other projects, a couple of play projects, a couple other film projects in the UK are brewing. My guess is that he's just working on that and unable to do it. In his place is Kerry Longmire again, who just in general, I think does a great job. The other thing that I'll say is Welles had several people who covered for him this entire time. I think Kerry Longmire is the most politically aligned with Welles. I don't know if I said that last time, but he fits with Welles's ideas on labor and the potential war with Russia and sort of foreign diplomacy in almost the exact same way Welles does. We don't get a clear sense of Kerry Longmire's position on the spheres of influence and how involved the United States should be with Russia exactly, but he does seem to be anti-war. Certainly, he doesn't, he's very clear about that. The other thing that I like to mention as a person from Metro Detroit is Kerry Longmire mentions a list of cities that he believed would be bombed by foreign countries if we were to share the atomic bomb. And he mentions Detroit as one of the list, along with New York and DC. For anybody who's not familiar, I assume people are, but Detroit at this time is the fourth largest city in the United States by population. It's the second largest by land. It's also considered by many to be the city of the future. It has a booming auto industry and manufacturing. And so it's, one of the key cities in the United States. So great to be called on, unfortunately, as an example of where he believes would be bombed. So that's not great. But anytime I can plug Detroit, I'm going to do it. And I was happy to hear it mentioned.
There you go. I'll mention one thing that when I first heard this episode, I was like, uh-oh. I was thinking, we're reaching the end here. Maybe he's going to have just guests for the rest of the time and never come back on. And I thought that would be a shame. But no, this was just a standalone again. And Orson will be back for weeks to come, which was great. But these are always kind of interesting. I'm kind of glad they're there because they just sort of let you get into another viewpoint or just a little different flavor than Orson, and bring a little more straightforwardness to it that these whenever he's not there. And I think there's been like 4 of them maybe over the whole course of the thing. So there hasn't been a lot, but and the fact that I'm also thankful for whatever group was in charge of sort of bringing these to us, that they didn't go, oh, it's not featuring Orson, so we won't digitize that or we won't save that. We'll just grab the Orson ones. Because it's very simple to do that. It'd be very simple to just kind of go, oh, that's not Orson, so we won't save that. But they did save them, and they are in here, and that's wonderful. Kathy, what were your thoughts on this one?
Well, I so agree with what you, Daryl and Vincent, have said. I find it a fascinating sort of moment. I was really impressed by how much Kerry Longmire, his opinions were very much aligned with Orson's. But again, a moment in time, these few months when America was the only one, the US is the only power to have the atomic bomb. And with this sudden hatred of Russia and putting them into the sort of Germany-like position of they are an enemy and they must be defeated. And this idea that some politicians and leaders we're saying that we can't delay. We must go ahead and bomb them out of existence. It's so frightening. To think that these leaders, you can sort of see where they're coming from, maybe, or that that these other leaders have this apocalyptic idea that it's just going, that Russia is going to be the exact same thing as Germany and Japan, and we got to take them out. This crazy, insane kind of cartoonish idea that if we just flatten Moscow like we'd flatten two cities in Japan, that it would the war forever would be over, and somehow America would be on the top of what's left of the world heap. And I so appreciate that Longmire is addressing the fantasies of any kind of quick settlement that would do. He's talking about the lives lost, the pain that Russia is so big, that they could, just like Napoleon, kind of found out, no matter how you try to conquer Russia, there will always be more Russians to come after you. But to think that there was this moment when people thought that we should be bombing things, that this was a major part of our arsenal that we really should be using. I'm awfully glad I was not alive in 1946, because just to think that people thought this was a real option just, gives me the willies. But I love how he summed it up for Longmire at the end for his audience of saying two big issues: inflation at home and the danger of internationally. What are we going to do about the growing Russian threat or growing Russian needs or differences? And I like how he manages to tie them together to say, even to the people who still want to go and bomb Russia, how that would bring more inflation at home. And considering that here in late 2021, a lot of people are talking about inflation again. Again, I'm fascinated by connections between sort of now and then, but at least Longmire's ability to try and reach out to listeners and saying, you're very worried about your families and how are we going to feed people, and don't let these cartoonish ideas about revenge or being aggressive carry you away. Slow down and think. That's what I really appreciated about it.
Wow, that's great. Thank you so much, Kathy. And to dovetail on that, it just makes me feel like listening to this whole series, but especially this episode, it just makes me so thankful for who we had as our leaders and everything during this time, and their stability and their ability to not get us into something, because it would have been a very easy conversation to have that we, for the first time in the history of the planet, we have the ability to take over. We could look at that. Instead of being the United States, we could be the United Planet, and everybody could be, and all these countries could be states of the United States, but it'd be the United Planet. And what a glorious thing that would be. And all we have to do is bomb a bunch of people and get them to realize that they need to bow to the United States or whatever. I mean, man, it could have been tempting to a lot of leaders that had the wrong mindset, but thank goodness that wasn't the case. Terry, what were your thoughts on this one?
Well, in addition to all the foreign policy perspectives that Kerry Longmire offered, the other alignment he had with Orson Welles was his views on Harry Truman, and he kind of beat up on the
Poor Harry,
the slips from Harry Truman, particularly his discussion of a couple of speeches, one by Wallace and one by Secretary of State Burns, and I wasn't there, and so I don't know how much of this was Truman being overwhelmed by all the stuff that he has to do. Presidents are oftentimes tasked with far more responsibilities than they should be, but in this case, Harry, like some of his successors, opened his mouth and stuck his foot in it, and so Longmire was quick to point that out.
Kerry, can I interrupt for just a second?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Do you know, or does anybody else know? Okay, we've talked in the last few weeks about how FDR switched vice presidents over to Truman. And I was thinking, boy, if I was switching vice presidents and I knew that I wasn't doing so hot, you would think you would pick someone that aligns with you tremendously, and where you go, okay, maybe somebody in my cabinet or something I would pick as my vice president or something.
No.
But
This was actually not a policy decision
right.
on FDR's part. This was a way of compromising with his within the Democratic Party with his critics to his right, who thought that Wallace was, like Roosevelt, was too liberal, and so they chose a more conservative Democrat in the person of Harry Truman to placate those on the more right-wing side of the Democratic Party. But I mean, on one hand, you're right. If you were president and got to choose who your running mate would be, of course you'd want someone who was like-minded. But keep in mind that Roosevelt was also waning in his own power. He was ill, and he was, dealing with the war, of course, which was the big pressure. But all this infighting that was going on within the ranks of his own party. So that's why he chose Truman. It had nothing to do with FDR thinking that they were going to agree on things.
Interesting.
But I also don't think that FDR thought that he was going to die before.
No,
his term
right.
ended.
No one thinks they're going to die.
He was only 65.
Yeah.
He was as ill as he looked, and he shouldn't have run for a fourth term, but they just too much chaos. You can't, if the war is not over, you can't change presidents in sort of midstream like
Right.
this.
Yeah, there was no chance that I mean, Roosevelt, if he were still alive and well, Roosevelt would be president today. He was that, but the choice of Harry Truman was kind of in that tradition of balance. They wanted to balance the ticket. In this case, it wasn't regional balance, it was partisan or
yeah, it's like bringing on a Pence. So
yeah,
the issue of attacking Truman for Longmire was an easy one because it was the Orson Welles position, and I agree with the rest of you. This was Welles without Welles, both in his viewpoints and the topics that he chose, and of course the fact that, on the other hand, Kerry Longmire was no Orson Welles.
Yeah.
I mean, he was fine. He was interesting, but I'm glad he wasn't on every week. I don't think we'd be doing a podcast about it.
Yes. All right. With that, I think we'll close it up because we got a lot of other stuff to get to. Enjoy this one, but please keep tuning in to all the future Orson Welles commentaries, because the last few are after this one are really, really great. So enjoy, and we'll see you next time.
Orson Welles, usually heard at this time, is unable to broadcast today. Instead, the American Broadcasting Company and its affiliated stations present Kerry Longmire in a commentary from Washington. And now, here is Kerry Longmire.
The cries grow more and more shrill. War with Russia. The diplomatic battle of Paris grows more strident. Molotov and Burns there in Paris make more of their fist-shaking speeches. The tension tightens in China, in Greece, in Palestine. And one hears those three words tossed about here in America more and more. War with Russia. Many Americans say we ought to declare war on Russia at once. Many others say, in the age of the atomic bomb, it's certain that war will break someday, and equally certain that destruction of New York, Washington, Detroit may follow. So, that argument continues, why wait until the Russians have the bomb? Why not launch a preventive war now? All of us have heard those three fighting words, the calls for war. 13 months after a bolt of man-made lightning wiped out 100,000 human beings in a fraction of a second at Hiroshima in Japan, mankind is in such a state of jitters, in other words, that scores of Americans now urge aggression. We don't like the way the Russians have been acting. Many Americans think the Russians are being stupid, to say the least, in their continual shouting of threats from an Anglo-American bloc. But is war, a war launched against Russia by us, any real answer? Yet one can find plenty of officers of the Army who think we should start that war and get it over with. Congressman Cox of Georgia, who seems to see Bolsheviks under every bed, has called publicly on the floor of Congress for such a war. Just 2 years ago, our armies were battling the Nazis in France. Tens of thousands of boys from Kansas and California and Pennsylvania were dying. 4 years ago, there was a raging battle for Guadalcanal. Is the memory of those who call so glibly for war today so short that they have forgotten that bloodshed and heartbreak? Yet the cry goes on, war with Russia. Certainly there are arguments today between Washington and Moscow, and big arguments. Ever since the actual shooting war stopped, a gigantic battle of power politics has raged all over this globe. It's nonsense to pretend that we are completely right and the Russians completely wrong, or vice versa. This name-calling contest does no credit to either side. We and the British, for instance, bolster up an outmoded monarchy in Greece, a Franco in Spain, a Chiang Kai-shek in China. Moscow backs a different set of horses. It backs up Tito in Yugoslavia, a left-wing Polish regime in Poland, and makes gestures of blandishment in the direction of the communists in Germany. We play the battle of the zones of influence just as much as do the Russians. There's no use in our pretending a holier-than-thou attitude, and our Secretary of State Burns and Russia's Foreign Commissar Molotov both know it. What's lost on both sides is the simple idea of justice in the world. The old and simple idea in the Declaration of Independence, the right of men, women, and children to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We and the people of Britain are obviously thinking not of justice when we cynically accept the London government's stern refusal to permit homeless Jews into Palestine. What we are thinking about is simply one thing, the possibility of war with the Russians. London and Washington want at all costs to avoid explosive riots and disorders there in the Holy Land, for fear that those riots will spread all over the Middle East and permit the Russians perhaps to move in there under the guise of mediation. And the Middle East, of course, holds the greatest oil reserves of the world, oil which is vital to the British and American navies in case of war. Thus, the Palestine issue is not being settled on any simple issue of justice for the Jews or for the Arabs. Every diplomatic decision in the world today, every decision in Washington and London as well as in Moscow, is colored by straight, outright fear, by the fear of war. Those men who gave their lives at Saint-Lô in France, at Guadalcanal, and at Stalingrad and Orel, too, in Russia, did not die just to lay the foundation for a new and more fierce war, yet that, today, is the obvious inference. Yet what would be the gain, really, for either side? Which one? If an atomic war broke today between America and Russia, that war would obviously involve the entire globe. If we think we made sacrifices to beat Hitler and Hirohito, those sacrifices would be nothing compared to the tremendous expense of men and money which would be necessary to bludgeon. In place of 1 million or so American casualties, there might be 10 million. And what would we gain, really, after dropping atomic bombs on Moscow and Leningrad and Stalingrad and the rest of the cities of Russia? The Russian people would still mostly be there. Millions of them would be wiped out, starved, but millions more would have retreated into Siberia. Guerrilla war with those Russian survivors would go on for years. If we think that our military government of Germany has been a conspicuous failure today, just how would American troops run that vast land of Russia also? To win that huge and gigantic war with Russia, a war which would take place both in Europe and in Asia, would then mean that America would be forced to feed about half the population of the globe at least. Plague and disease would certainly fill the earth. It would take at least a century, possibly more, to rebuild any sort of civilization. Do those who talk so glibly of war with Russia ever think of these inevitable results? Today, the United States is confronted with two chief issues. One, of course, is the rising cost of living. The other is how to improve relations with Russia, how to put a stop, that is, to this battle of power politics, which is now giving the world the jitters. If Americans were handling the problems of the home front here a little better, the international jitters might not be quite so sharp. Last week, the Labor Department made an announcement which got very few headlines. The cost of living, we were told, in the month from July 15th to August 15th, went up by another 2%. In the previous month, that month in which Congress scuttled price control and came up with a new price law with virtually no teeth in it, the index of living costs had jumped by 6%. There has been no 2-month period in history in which the cost of living in this country has soared so hugely. A rise of 8% means that millions of families can now buy less meat, less milk, less bread. Children cannot get their extra pair of shoes. Perhaps an insurance policy must be canceled in many families, and the cost of living is still rising. It's no wonder that the nation is torn by strikes, strikes in shipping, in other spots, and threatened strikes all over the land. What else did Congress expect, anyway, last June and July? when it listened to those hordes of Washington lobbyists who shouted so violently against price control. Congressman Sabbath of Illinois, who has served 40 years in Congress and is the dean of the House, said then, during that debate on OPA, that he had never seen anything like the outright manipulation of legislation in Congress by lobbyists. Chester Bowles, then stabilization director, warned that if price control were weakened, the cost of living would soar so sharply that a new wave of labor disorders in the nation would be inevitable in about 60 to 90 days. Well, something like 70 days have now passed, and Chester Bowles was eminently correct. The strikes are here. More strikes are doubtless coming. Mr. Bowles, disgusted with the way things were going in Washington, is making a bid tomorrow before the Connecticut State Democratic Convention in Hartford, Connecticut, for the governorship of Connecticut. The rising living costs, the wave of strikes, are two more things which ought to be pondered by those Americans who shout so violently today for war with Russia or for war with anyone else. Haven't they stopped to think that if a new war breaks, there will be much more inflation? That the pressure then for soaring prices and soaring wages cannot possibly be stopped? War inevitably brings huge economic dislocation. If we launched a new war today, we would see such a wave of inflation tomorrow that no insurance policy and no bank account might eventually be worth a nickel. Those who wish to strengthen the capitalist system, as I think virtually all of us Americans do, are playing with dynamite when they talk so glibly of this proposed war against the communists across the seas. Is plunging the world into anarchy any way to preserve capitalism or democracy? The debate on all this was pointed up sharply last week by President Truman's rather comic slip in his offhand comment at his Thursday news conference on Henry Wallace's Thursday night speech in New York, the speech in which Mr. Wallace lashed out bitterly at the present policy of getting tough with Russia being followed by Secretary of State Burns, a policy endorsed, of course, by President Truman. If the topic were not so full of potential tragedy, and any major war today would be the most utter tragedy the world has ever seen, to repeat, if the topic were not so filled with potential tragedy, the story would be very funny. The moral might be drawn that President Truman has a positive gift for putting his foot in his mouth. The president is in such hot water today that even the Republicans probably feel a little sorry for him. But the country wonders how long it will take for the president to learn to quit making offhand statements which set off sensations all over the world. Everyone knows by now how President Truman's slip on Thursday came about. Secretary Wallace was due to make a speech that night, and the Wallace speech warned that if we simply tried to combat Russian influence by a shouting contest with Moscow, by a war of words, then we will get nowhere. Mr. Wallace went on to say that it is no more business of ours what Russia does in Eastern Europe than it is Russia's business what we do at the Panama Canal and in the Western Hemisphere. Now, this was obviously a slashing attack from within President Truman's own official family on his policy, and the policy, incidentally, of Secretary of State Burns. At first, when a correspondent asked him about the speech, the president interrupted and said no, he couldn't comment on a speech still unmade, since this was Thursday afternoon and Mr. Wallace was not speaking until that night. Then the president's agreeable nature got the better of him. He told the correspondent, yes, he had read Mr. Wallace's speech, and yes, Mr. Wallace was correct in saying Mr. Truman agreed with the speech. Further, the president said he saw no difference in the Wallace and the Burns views. Well, a sensation, obviously enough, hit Paris immediately. Hit London and Moscow, too. Senators Connolly and Vandenberg, who were there in Paris with Mr. Burns, immediately issued statements demanding, in effect, to know what the president was thinking about anyway in cutting the ground out from under his own Secretary of State. Opinion in London was caustic. Senator Taft and other Republicans wanted to know how many policies does this government have anyway. Finally, yesterday afternoon, the abashed Mr. Truman called in the White House reporters to read a brief statement. He said he had answered the question on Thursday so quickly that his answer didn't convey his full meaning. All he meant, he insisted grimly, was that he approved the right of Henry Wallace to make his speech. But this is not the first time that President Truman has been in hot water over his offhand comments. The president is an eminently agreeable man. About a year ago, down in Tennessee, Mr. Truman was enjoying himself at a party at Reelfoot Lake one night with his traveling White House party and the news correspondents. He beamed subtly at the newsmen and said he didn't know why he couldn't tell them what he thought about the atomic bomb. The effect of his statement, made strictly off the cuff, so to speak, was that we, in this country, had made the bomb, we had the bomb, and what did any other country want to do about it anyway? Well, that belligerent comment got not only Moscow mad, it got London mad, too, and Ottawa as well. Prime Minister Attlee of Britain rushed to Washington, and Mr. Truman had to back down on his atomic pronouncement. The three governments would work for international controls, it was announced, of the terrible atomic weapon. When Winston Churchill came to America to make his belligerently anti-Russian speech at Fulton, Missouri, the president might diplomatically have sidestepped any endorsement of that fiery challenge to Moscow. President Truman did not sidestep any such endorsement, however. He blithely rode to Missouri with Mr. Churchill in a special train. He sat on the platform with Mr. Churchill and beamed at the audience. Who could doubt, after that he gave the Churchill words his full endorsement? And that speech of Mr. Churchill today in Moscow is being cited by the Russians as prime proof that the outer world wants war with Russia. Yet, after that Missouri incident, Mr. Truman turned around on Thursday here and asserted that he endorsed a speech of Henry Wallace's, whose effect was exactly the reverse of the Churchill speech. Yesterday, the agreeable president had to back down. The question is thus commencing to arise here as to just where agreeableness ends and a real hard-thought policy begins. The current strike situation can be traced straight back to last February. The nation's steel industry then was tied up by a strike. Chester Bowles and his economists were prepared to grant a moderate price increase on steel, coupled with a moderate wage boost to settle the strike. John Snyder, President Truman's friend, then reconversion boss, stepped in suddenly and granted the steel companies a price boost double what the economists had recommended. President Truman comfortably agreed. He said this was just a little bulge in the inflation line and that the bulge would not expand into a wide break. The price control and wage control officials, though, were baffled and exasperated. Their agreeable president and his pal, Mr. Snyder, had wrecked their plans for really tough controls to keep prices and wages in hand and stop inflation. Well, today, as we can all see, the bulge in the inflation line is an open hole in the dike. Today, relations with Russia, too, the second big problem of our time, are equally bad. Agreeableness in Washington does not seem to be any substitute, one might say, for real policies.
You have just heard Kerry Longmire in a special commentary from Washington. Orson Welles, who is usually heard at this time, will be back over many of these same stations next Sunday. This is ABC, the American Broadcasting Company.